Hi, I'm Walter Grayman, representing the Environmental and Water Resources Institute's WDSA History Project. The purpose of this project is to document the history of water distribution systems analysis. An important part of this project is a series of interviews with engineers, modelers, practitioners, and researchers who have contributed significantly in this field. Our interview today is with Robert Clark. As Director of EPA's Water Supply and Water Resources Division from 1985 to 1999, Bob was responsible for the robust research program in water quality and water distribution systems. That program resulted in many developments in the area of water quality modeling and monitoring, including the development of EPA Net, and is responsible for spurring a wide range of external developments in water distribution systems analysis. This interview is being conducted on October 15, 2015 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Bob, you joined the Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service in 1961 and were detailed to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency at its creation in 1971. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in those very early years with the Public Health Service and EPA? Was there a feeling of anticipation when EPA was first created?
Well, let me thank you, Walter, for the opportunity to participate in the committee's activities. I think what you're doing is very, very important. Just by way of background, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I received my BS degree in civil engineering in 1960 from Oregon State University. During that time, I had a chance to really take a lot of math. I was very interested in mathematics and took a lot of courses in numerical calculus and became interested in the potential for computers. At that time, as you probably know, every male over 18 had to fulfill his selective service obligations. So I was a little young in my class. I knew my draft board wasn't going to call me for another year, so I went ahead and pursued another BS degree in mathematics at Portland State College. About that time, I also obtained a commission in the U.S. Public Health Service to satisfy my selective service obligation, and it's a good thing I did because my draft board called me up about a month after I left Portland to join the U.S. Public Health Service. Because of my background in mathematics and computer science, I was assigned to the Robert A. Taft Sanitary Engineering Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. There's a lot of activity going on in the environment in those days. It was becoming a very big issue in our society. My first job was working in a radionuclide tracking group, and we went out and we looked at the reactors that the Atomic Energy Commission had been building around the country, which were very leaky. We did a lot of work on tracking radionuclides in the environment. We found that the Animas River had been sterilized through the mining of uranium. We did a lot of work on industrial discharges, and there was really generally growing concern in the country that there were some important environmental issues that we really needed to address. In 1962, Rachel Carson wrote her novel Silent Spring, and I think that really alerted people to the impact of pesticides in the environment. So I think what was happening in the 60s was really the beginning of a strong environmental movement. People were beginning to recognize that we really needed to manage industrial and waste discharges, and so I think it began this. I think that's what if we had a period in society when there was a growing interest in environment as sort of the impetus for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, I would say it probably occurred in the 60s. While I was in Cincinnati at the Robert A. Taft Sanitary Engineering Center, I took courses in graduate courses in mathematics and mathematical physics, and I left the EPA after I'd served my time in the Commissioned Corps. I left the Public Health Service and went on to graduate school for another year, and then went back in to the Public Health Service after I got my master's degree and was assigned to New Jersey, doing basically oceanography work, looking at wastewater discharges into New York Harbor. Then was reassigned again to the Robert A. Taft Sanitary Engineering Center to work on the project that had been started with the Harvard Water Resources School. And so we were looking at the application of operations research and management and systems analysis to water resources problems. About that time, there was this growing concern about reorganizing environmental activities in the government, and the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration was created. It was kind of chaos in the Public Health Service because they took away a lot of the functions of the Public Health Service and created the FWPCA, and Public Health Service officers were kind of split as to whether to resign their commissions or stay in the Commission Corps. I was offered a position, I was offered the opportunity for outside training, and went to Cornell for 2 years in which I studied solid waste management. Came back and I spent 4 years in the solid waste management program at the end. That was in the early 70s as EPA was being created. The solid waste program was transferred to Washington, and I was offered an opportunity to be on the staff of the newly created National Environmental Research Center in Cincinnati. And my assignment in that position was to help create the water supply program that was to be created as far as EPA, a major water supply research center in Cincinnati. So I spent 2 years doing that, and during that time is when I really developed my interest and awareness of the impact of water supply and how important it was. In 1970, in 74, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed, and I was offered an opportunity to actually become part of the water supply research program in Cincinnati and work for Gordon Robeck. And that's where I really began to focus my interest on water supply issues. In the 70s, one of the unique aspects of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was passed in 74, was that it really changed the way we looked at water supply in the United States. It created a set of national standards for the first time. It required that that the cost be considered when standards were set. And for the very first time, it really incorporated the concept of looking at water supply as a complete system in which we would deal with discharges from the water treatment plant through the distribution system to the consumer. So that's really changed the nature of the way we viewed water supply in a professional way. And at the time, there was a great deal of consternation when the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed. There was a lot of concern about whether or not it was going to be constitutional, lots of challenges with that. There was sort of a cry that there'd be federal inspectors coming from every tap. And so it was a period of a lot of both creative opportunity, but also a lot of the people in the industry were quite disconcerted about the impact of the act, and so it became a very, very interesting and challenging time. It was at that point that I really began to look at, and I was assigned, one of my assignments, my first assignment in the water supply program, was to look at the issue of cost and the issue of how would we deal with the changes in quality and the cost impacts of supplying water, not only through the treatment plant, which had been kind of the traditional approach to looking at drinking water, but also through the system to the consumer. And that's when I began to look at the water supply and water supply modeling as a mechanism for doing that.
Interesting. You recently made a presentation at the 2015 EWRI Congress and wrote a very detailed paper on the history of the EPA research program in water modeling in distribution systems. A video of that presentation is available in our project's video archive, so I don't want to duplicate that information in this interview. However, are there some particular highlights or stories that you would like to share with us about that research?
Yeah, I think that, it was a pretty exciting time. I think, of course, you and Dick Males joined me in terms of looking at how we would analyze water quality changes that would occur in drinking water distribution systems. We conducted a great deal of research on validating and developing the model. And there's a whole range of activities that we engaged in, including a lot of field activities, a lot of field studies that were challenging. I think we probably started our work in the late 90s, and it was all the way through until 92 before EPA Net was developed. And I recall a number of interesting experiences during our field studies. One time, I remember during some work we did in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which I'm sure you remember as well. We were out, we had been working with the water utility, and we were going to take some samples. We were doing tracers was one of the fundamental aspects of our studies. And we were planning on taking some samples from individual homes in order to track the tracer through the system. And we had worked with the water utility and made sure that the homes we selected would be aware that we were coming to take samples. Unfortunately, it turned out that the water utility people talked to the housewife who was there during the day, but not to the husband who was there when we were doing the actual sampling, and we were met with a homeowner with a gun ordering us off the property, and we certainly left as quickly as we could, but that was an exciting aspect of some of the work that we were doing.
Under your watch, the EPA Net software package was developed. It's grown into its history over its 20-some years now is quite fantastic. How did that happen?
I think it's well. First off, you remember very well how difficult it was to conduct the analysis of the water quality changes in the drinking water networks. I know that you and Dick did a lot of the computations by hand. We ran the hydraulic model first, then overlaid the water quality transport and fate and effect analysis on top of that, and it was extremely cumbersome, time-consuming. And it was becoming obvious that we needed to come up with an integrated system that would involve both the hydraulic modeling as well as the water quality modeling together. And it happened that during that period while we were going through that sort of realization that I was giving a lecture at an in-house seminar at EPA, and I was talking about the work that we were doing, and Lou Rossman was sitting in the audience, and Lou approached me after the lecture, and he sort of challenged what I was doing and implied or said that he thought that it was basically trivial and a waste of time, as I recall. And I challenged him back, and I said, well, if you feel that way, then why don't you sit down and talk to me about it, and I'll explain to you what we're doing, and we'll see if you can help us with it. And Lou had a very excellent reputation as an engineering programmer, so he had the potential for being very helpful. We sat down and talked, and I explained to him what we were doing and gave him some data to work with, and he basically went home and over the weekend worked out a scheme for developing what turned out to be later as the basis for EPA Net. And I talked to his division director, he was working in the wastewater program at the time, and asked if Lou could be assigned to our division to help us work on pulling the modeling together, and it worked out that way, and finally I eventually got him assigned to our division, and I think the rest is history. I think one of the best decisions that I ever made with regard to EPNet was to make it public sector, because I think because of that, it's had wide dissemination, it's been very useful, and we've encouraged people to make modifications that would fit their own needs, and it's just been tremendously satisfying to see that the spread of the modeling and becoming a standardized technique throughout the field.
As you're aware, since Lou Rossman has retired, the future of EPANet is sort of being debated, and it's not clear exactly as to how it's going to be further developed. And any thoughts on that?
Well, I know that there's some movement to make it an open source model. I know some of the folks at the University of Cincinnati who've kind of pursued that idea. I think that's a very good idea, and I've had some discussions with the folks at EPA who are most closely affiliated with EPANet and its application, and they seem very supportive of that idea. I had suggested to actually Dominic Bacelli is the person who seems to be leading that, and I had suggested to Dom that he might want to consider putting together a seminar or a workshop, an international workshop that would draw together some of the outstanding people in the field who have been involved in modeling, and basically lay out the foundations and sort of a plan for developing an open source procedure for EPANet. And I even asked some of the folks at EPA if they thought they might be willing to sponsor such a workshop, and I got a very positive response. And so hopefully it's important enough and of such general use to the industry that something like that could happen, and I think that could work. and work very well. I certainly would like to see it disseminated and made as user-friendly as possible.
It's interesting that conference sort of harkens back to a seminar that you sponsored and helped organize with AWRF back in 1991, where essentially all of the people who had been working in water distribution system water quality modeling, which is a fairly small number around the world, came together and for 2 or 3 days talked about what they were doing and where things were going. And that was a very successful in terms of kick-starting the whole field.
Yeah, I think it's, and you remember that well because you and Dick Males were very involved in setting that up, and I agree. I think it was highly successful. I think it set the agenda for distribution system modeling for the next 15 to 20 years. You know, we were able to work with the American Water Works Association Research Foundation, which was called then, it's now called the Water Research Foundation, but we were able to incorporate input from all over the world, any of the people who were working in the modeling area. And I thought we laid out a very successful agenda, which we have basically both EPA and the Water Research Foundation have followed. And I think something similar to that could be very successful and have the same kind of an impact. And so I'm hoping that Dom and maybe the EPA folks would follow up on that. I think there's a lot of potential for doing that kind of thing.
Over the years, there's been a little bit of a mixed relationship between EPA and development of EPA Net and the commercial companies. And essentially, most of the commercial projects that are available today are directly based on EPA Net. In fact, use the engine. But they sometimes are concerned that EPA is then competing with them. Any comments on that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting, and of course you were involved in that as well. And I think that I understand the concern over the people who do proprietary modeling. They've made a big investment in certainly in user interface and marketing and technical assistance, and they want to see that returned. And they felt, and I think when they were in the early days, they felt that we were competing with them. But one of the points that I used to make, and I still make, is that EPA is not in a position to provide the technical assistance and implementation guidance that the utilities need. It's to really apply modeling, as you know, and others who have done it. You need a long-term commitment, and you need calibration, you need follow-through, you need to analyze results, you need to go back and make changes. It's really a long-term relationship if you're going to do modeling for water quality purposes in a drinking water distribution system. And EPA doesn't have the resources and doesn't really have the mandate to provide that kind of support. So I think even though I know that there was a lot of concern among people who were interested in proprietary model development about EPA Net, I think actually my opinion is the EPA Net really set the market. And I used to make that pitch to the people who would come to me, that we would create the market. Is one of the most, I think, exciting developments about EPA Net was that distribution system modeling is now embedded in the Drinking Water Act regulations, that's a requirement. And so I think what we did is we started to set the criteria and the benchmarks, but it's the proprietary modeling people and the companies who will actually do the implementation. And I really don't think there never has been, and I don't think there's any conflict now. And in fact, I think the two activities really supplement each other. But I understand if you spend a lot of money on a model and modeling procedures, and you see someone coming along distributing it as essentially free software, that there's an immediate reaction. And we dealt with a lot of that. I spent a fair amount of time talking to congressional liaison representatives at EPA who had been approached by the congressmen had been approached by some of the people who were developing proprietary models. But I really don't think it's a conflict. I think it's actually very complementary.
You had the opportunity to work with some of the other real pioneers in the environmental engineering water supply field, such as Ed Geldreich, Rolf Deininger, Gordon Robeck, and many others who are no longer living, since we obviously can't interview them and didn't before they passed away. I wonder if you can share some of your experiences and observations about them and others.
Yeah, I think certainly Ed and Rolf and Gordon were outstanding professionals, as were many others. I worked extensively with a gentleman named Lee McCabe, who was one of the first water epidemiologists who I really admired, and was just he was a terrific professional. But it's interesting that Ed and Rolf and Gordon were all consummate professionals. They really they were very devoted to the profession. They were very involved and directed in their work, but they were extremely different personalities. Ed was a much more difficult personality for me to deal with anyway. He had a darker kind of personality. Rolf was the life of the party, a wonderful person to be around when we weren't involved in professional activities. And Gordon was very, very smart, very, very intuitive, and somewhat in between. And I think one of the great pleasures for me in my life was when I was selected to replace Gordon as the director of the water supply program and water supply research program at EPA. But yeah, there's an awful lot of people, almost too many, both academically and in the public health service and in the EPA and in the profession, who I dealt with, who were real inspirations and really visionary in terms of the need to do environmental work and to look at the development of environmental science.
There's a feeling in the profession, in the water distribution modeling profession, that there's been a little bit of a split, and that's getting more significant recently, and that is the researchers who are developing various things and doing research, and the practitioners who are using models, and that these two communities are not talking to each other enough. Any comments on that in terms of what you've done in the past to try to bring those two together and what maybe should be done in the future?
That's a good question. I think it's an interesting observation, and I think there might be some truth in that there is a little bit of a deviance from the people that are doing some of the model development, who tend to be more, I think, in the academic field, than the people that are actually applying the models, who tend to be more in consulting. And I'm not sure now that EPA. I think one of the weaknesses that I see with EPA is that they're not, the EPA people are not as actively involved in pursuing the development of models, and not as actively involved in working with the profession to make sure that they get applied properly. And so I think that's just, perhaps that's the evolution of the field. I don't know, but I do share some of those concerns and some of those observations. So I agree with that.
You've been very active and won numerous awards from AWWA, including the prestigious AP Black Research Award and the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Huber, the Herring, and other awards. How have these professional associations contributed to your own work and development, and generally to the developments in the water distribution system area?
Yeah, I have received a number of awards for my work, but I had a lot of really great people around me, so it's really more a reflection, I think, of the efforts of a lot of very good people than mine alone. So, but I certainly appreciate that recognition. Over the years, and you're certainly aware of this, and that we've been called upon to make a number of presentations and involvement in workshops, and the professional organizations have been amazingly instrumental in helping us provide that kind of information. I've always found working with organizations like AWWA and ASCE have been extremely beneficial, because it provides a venue for us to get our work out and to find a very sympathetic audience and a supporting audience for that work. So the professional organizations are, in my mind, in my opinion, have really been invaluable in terms of helping us disseminate what we're doing and getting a terrific feedback and improving what we were working on. So it's a very symbiotic relationship as far as I'm concerned, very beneficial to all sides. So I guess one plug I'll put in, that for EPA, in my last year as the director of the Water Supply and Water Resources Division, I received the Diversity Leadership Award from EPA, and it's for the manager or the individual who contributes most to the development of his colleagues' careers, as well as for for encouraging women and minorities to achieve professional goals. And to me, that was perhaps one of the best awards that I received, and the one that I look back with the greatest affection on and fondness of.
Interesting. Going back a little bit, back in the 1980s and 1990s, there were some very highly visible cases where water distribution systems became contaminated and resulted in actually many fatalities. Think about Milwaukee and Kabul and Gideon's, and before that, Woburn. Can you talk a little bit about what role you and EPA and modeling played in terms of looking at those cases?
Yeah, I think modeling, and that hits on another topic that I wanted to discuss a little bit later, but as we go into this interview. But yes, I think we used modeling in a couple of waterborne disease outbreak cases for the very first time, and it helped provide enormous insights into what the causes were. And I also think it helped maybe lead to some solutions in the long term. For example, one of them in Gideon, Missouri, we did a study in which the municipal water tank was contaminated. And it's a small town of about 2,000 people, but over 60% of the population became infected with salmonellosis from the bird contamination in the distribution tanks, and 7 people died. We were able to use modeling as a means of determining what the cause of the outbreak was. And then from that, EPA then conducted a series of studies throughout all of the 10 EPA regions on water tank contamination, and discovered that many of the violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act that they were experiencing were the result of tank contamination. And I think it's kind of created a sort of a new awareness of the importance of tanks in distribution systems and the impact that they could have on water quality. I think the same thing later was found out in Washington, D.C., and I think, Walter, you worked on that, in which they looked at tanks as a source of contamination. So it's a very kind of practical indication of how modeling can really have an impact in terms of understanding issues related to water quality and public health.
It's obviously impossible in a short interview to cover everything that you've worked on in the half century, I guess, that you've been in this area. Anything else you'd like to share with us, and maybe discuss a little bit about what you see happening in the future?
Yeah, I think, first off, I'm very pleased with the work we did, and I think the direction it's taken. I think it appears that and it also appears that in the proprietary field, as you mentioned earlier, most of the models that are being used now and applied now are actually based on the work we did on developing EPA Net. There has been a lot of work, I noticed recently, on optimization techniques. That's tended to be done more by academics, and I have to admit that I somewhat question how much of that has actually been applied in the field. It's very interesting work. It provides the basis for a lot of academic dissertations. I'm not sure how much it actually results in actual changes that take place. On the other hand, I know that the concept of water quality modeling has become fairly widely used by the drinking water utilities throughout the world, and I think it has had some real beneficial results in terms of things like designing tanks and the turnover rates in tanks and location of tanks, the impact of variation in demand on water quality transport and systems and so forth. So those things, I think, have been positive results from our work. I think that the effect that the study on making EPA Net a multi-species model was a very good step and has potential for the future. One of the areas that I think I would like to see more work in is sort of the fundamental chemistry, biology, and hydraulic interactions that take place at the pipe wall and what impact that has on the transport of things like disinfectant residuals in the system. I think one of the next phases in distribution system water quality modeling will probably be real-time water quality modeling. I think the ability to manage water quality and potentially respond to emergencies that might take place in the field could be a very productive sort of direction for water quality modeling to go. And I'm hoping that if this open source initiative takes place, that would be one of the things they work on. And I'm thinking of an example in Charleston, West Virginia, where if they had effective water quality models in the network, I think they could have mitigated the effects of some of the industrial discharges that got into the drinking water distribution system. So I think there's still some things to do that are very challenging and are going to be very productive. So and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the seminar. I think in the interview series, I think is going to be very useful for the field.
Thank you very much, Bob.